Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to speak up to 15 minutes prior to the scheduled roll call vote.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have a resolution that I'm looking forward to passing here on the Senate floor. I'm pretty sure no one's going to object to it. We'll see in a minute. But before I begin, I want to do a huge shout out and congratulations to Alaska's own Aliv Kelter and the U.S. women's rugby team. Thanks to Aliv's score late in the first half, the Americans beat the vaunted Australians in rugby to deliver the women's rugby team's first Olympic medal in rugby sevens. So, great job, Aliv. Great job to the American women's rugby team. Getting some medals there for our great nation. So, Mr. President, I'm here on the floor today to ask unanimous consent for a long overdue resolution. And it's a resolution that I guarantee you most Americans are going to be like, what? Wait, what? We haven't done that yet? The Senate, the Congress hasn't done that yet? And it's a resolution on this: recognizing the heroic service of our Vietnam veterans and finally issuing an apology, yes, for the way in which tens of thousands of them were treated when they came home after serving their nation. So that's what I'm going to do right here. I was told a couple minutes ago someone was going to object, and I was like, whoa, really? Let's have that debate. Let's have that debate. But, Mr. President, good news, no objection. So what I wanted to do briefly is just explain the reasoning behind this resolution. And I think as a country, when you look at the broad sweep of American history, we have always rightfully respected, lionized, and celebrated America's veterans. Think about it in the last several decades. The World War II generation, we even have a name for them, the greatest generation, sacrificed over 400,000 Americans killed in action, saving the world from dictatorships in Europe and in the Pacific. The greatest generation, literally defending freedom all over the world. When they came home, and to this day, we celebrate them, we lionize them, ticker tape parades, as it should be. At that moment in our history, the respect for our veterans was sky high. Then you had the Korean War. And unfortunately, in my view, I'm a Korean War history buff, and I've studied this a lot. You had kind of an attitude of benign neglect. Even the phrase, the forgotten war, which I don't like, should be called the noble war, actually, kind of indicates this benign neglect. The veterans came home. People didn't really celebrate what they did. It wasn't really like World War II. It was just kind of, okay, get on with your life. You did your duty. They sacrificed, of course. But there wasn't a lot. It was kind of benign neglect, as I mentioned. And then, Mr. President, the Vietnam War happened. And then we all know what happened, but to this day, I think most Americans maybe don't even understand what happened. But there's no doubt our country went off kilter. And the respect given to our service members, World War II certainly at the high level, even the Korean War, benign neglect, this respect hit rock bottom. It hit rock bottom. And you know, it's just really sad. We all have heard stories of veterans coming home, corporals, enlisted guys, young officers. They did their duty. Some of whom were drafted, said, it's my turn to go. And for whatever reason, Vietnam was, of course, very contentious, but for whatever reason, when they came home, a lot of people in the American public took it out on them. Slander, spit upon, all kinds of horrible epithets. I remember, Mr. President, one of my first mess nights as a Marine officer. I was a brand new second lieutenant. We had a mess night with a lot of these old retired Marines. very formal, sacred setting in many ways. One of the officers there talked about how he came home from Vietnam. His dad was a World War II vet. He had been in 12 months of combat, came home to see his father, hugged his dad. They're walking outside of the airport, and somebody threw red paint on him and his dad. Could you imagine that? You just sacrificed for your country? You're in uniform with your father who's a World War II vet? What did we do that for? I don't know if there's ever going to be an answer, but this happened literally to tens of thousands of Vietnam veterans. And it shouldn't have happened, Mr. President, but it did. So what we can do here in the Senate is just say, hey, we recognize your great service. It wasn't easy. You were doing your duty. And if you were treated horribly, which a lot of them were when they came home, again, maybe you go attack President Johnson or President Nixon, not attack, but criticize them, but why take it out on the Lance Corporal? That's what happened. Shouldn't have happened. So what we can do here, Mr. President, and we're going to do it in a second, I'm really glad no one's objecting, hope no one's objecting, is that my resolution, Senate Resolution 778, it's got a lot of senators supporting it, is simply acknowledging the courage and sacrifice of our veterans from the Vietnam War and apologizing for the treatment so many of them received when they came home. Pretty simple. And welcome them home. Finally, from the U.S. Senate. This resolution lays out their heroic service. It talks about the sacrifice. 58,000 members of the armed forces lost their lives. More than 300,000 Americans were wounded in Vietnam. And yet, many who served bravely and faithfully to the United States during the Vietnam War were repeatedly targeted with shameful attacks when they came home. Why? I don't know. That never really happened in our history before, and it should never happen again. And Mr. President, here's the beautiful thing about our Vietnam vets. Instead of being racked and incapacitated by bitterness or anger, our Vietnam veterans, and I've seen it throughout my career in the military, when they came home, they said, here's what we're going to do. We're treated really poorly. We're going to work really hard to make sure the next generation of veterans that serve overseas aren't treated poorly, that we get back to this level of World War II treatment. And guess what, Mr. President? The Vietnam vets succeeded in that. The vast majority of Americans, they look at our veterans, whether they agreed with a war in Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere else, when they see the vets, they say, thank you. Heroic service. We might not have liked the war, but we're certainly not going to take it out on you, Lieutenant or Corporal. And that group, our Vietnam vets, they had a lot to do with us bringing and come back to that level. I saw this throughout my entire military career. I just retired out of the Marine Corps a few months ago after 30 years. I'll give you one example, Mr. President. I had a sergeant, one of my Marine recon units, who was killed by an avalanche in Alaska. Great guy. And so we're having a service to bury him. Very somber. I was just a captain, but I was the lead officer overseeing this service. And these guys pull up in motorcycles, Vietnam vets. It's like 5 of them at this service, just sitting there. After the service, they came up to me. I said, hey, thank you guys for coming to the service of my sergeant. I said, did you know him? Nope. We didn't know him. We just saw that he was killed, and we wanted to come here to honor him. Think about that. Those are Vietnam veterans in my great state of Alaska who probably didn't get treated well and said, we're going to go to the funeral of this Marine sergeant to make sure he gets the respect that everybody should have gotten. And certainly that the Vietnam vet generation should have gotten, but so many didn't. So this resolution, Mr. President, does that. It recognizes the extraordinary sacrifice of our Vietnam vets, commends them for their courage and sacrifice, urges the President and on behalf of the Congress to formally acknowledge the widespread mistreatment of veterans of the Vietnam War when they came back home, and offers on behalf of the Congress a long overdue apology and encourages and expresses support for increased educations in the schools of the United States to reflect on and learn about the courage and sacrifice of this group of veterans. And unfortunately, sometimes the lack of support when they came home. So that's what the resolution does, Mr. President. And so, Mr. President, as if in legislative session and notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Resolution 778, which is at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Thank you. S-Res 778, a resolution acknowledging the courage and sacrifice of veterans of the Vietnam War and expressing regret for the mistreatment of veterans returning home from the war.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. And with that, given that there is no objection, that Senate resolution has now passed in the United States. Unanimously is on record, finally in 2024, thanking our Vietnam veterans for their service, for their sacrifice, acknowledging the mistreatment they got when they came home, welcoming them home, and saying, on behalf of the Congress of the United States, we do apologize for the mistreatment that you received, and we know that you are the key to making sure future generations of veterans are honored. So to our Vietnam vets, welcome home. Thank you. I yield the floor.